Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight's movie is 1959's The Giant Gila Monster, directed by Ray Kellogg.
This engine's still warm.
Say, did you see the skid marks out here? They go at a direct right angle to the direction of travel.
No digs in the macadam either. Somebody was hurt. There's blood all over this thing.
What is this black menace that kills everything it sees and hears? No human mind could imagine the enormous destructive power of this maddened, killing thing. If you're young people in love, look out. If you're driving a lonely road, you're as good as dead.
There's been a lot of livestock missing lately. That doesn't make headlines, but now it's people.
Never in the history of the United States, a monster of such size and power and horrifying hatred of man.
In the 1950s, films like The Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause highlighted juvenile delinquency and kicked off a decade's worth of similar movies. Most of them cheap exploitation films like 1955's Teenage Tramp, which is pretty much self-explanatory, and 1956's So Young, So Bad, in which the psycho leader of a gang of girl hoodlums stomps a bunny rabbit to death. These are just two examples of hundreds of movies of this type that were shot and released well into the 1970s. The only thing really changing in them being the clothing and the lingo. Since the rise of rock and roll coincided with the general recognition of this problem, desperate parents, teachers, sociologists, and religious leaders pointed to it as at least a contributing factor, if not the outright cause. This is, of course, complete nonsense. The only thing music really does, and this is documented, is to cause young people to dress like idiots. From zoot suits to incredibly baggy pants worn below the hips, from glitter to face piercing, from hippie clothing to white three-piece suits, music has inspired most of the more idiotic fashion trends in this country. I wasn't immune to this, by the way. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't wear hideous shirts, platform shoes, and bell-bottoms in the 70s, which, as I've pointed out before, was possibly the single worst decade in the history of the world to come of age in. I look at pictures of myself from back then and just cringe at the thought of going out in public like that. But I take comfort in the fact that I know I'm not alone in that feeling. Every generation has gone through that embarrassment, and the young people of today are going to go through it a lot worse than we ever did. That tattoo on your ankle is very cool now, but I hope you like wearing socks with your dresses once you hit 36 or so. Anyway, The Giant Gila Monster has a good deal in common with other movies of its time. The teenagers aren't really bad kids, they just want to have some fun. The fact that they get eaten by a giant Gila monster is just bad luck. Of course, the rich old guy in town whose son is eaten at the beginning of the picture is hell-bent on blaming someone for it. So, of course, he chooses Chase Winstead, the hard-working mechanic slash hot rodder slash rock and roll singer, with the widowed mother and the crippled little sister to blame the disappearance on. Oddly, especially in this kind of a movie, the local sheriff is a good friend of our young hero and actually sticks up for him until the old rich guy uses his influence to go over his head. The sheriff in this film actually listens to Chase instead of dismissing him out of hand, not that this does any good. It's not until the title monster attacks a dance that the powers that be sit up and pay attention. One of the cliches of this type of film is what I just mentioned, the monster attacking a dance. The reason for this is that it would have been prohibitively expensive for the monster to waltz into town and start destroying buildings and such, as in 1961's Gorgo or 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. A teen dance, however, allowed the filmmakers an opportunity to shoehorn in a number of elements that were considered to be essential for any 1950s horror movie, those being kids dancing with wild abandon and less than passable skill, and rock and roll music. As I pointed out in the intro to Frankenstein's Daughter, actual rock and roll and what reared a pinheaded skull in horror movies were two very different things. Artists such as Little Richard or Jerry Lee Lewis scared the hell out of parents. If you've ever seen The Girl Can't Help It, which is probably the best movie ever made when it comes to exposing rock and roll performers in their element, you know what I'm talking about. For example, the scene where Tom Ewell takes Jane Mansfield around town to various clubs to show her off and generate interest in her. We get a fair cross-section of the talent of the time performing as opposed to trying to act. The problem with most, if not all, of the rock and roll movies of the time, such as 1956's Don't Knock the Rock and others of that ilk, is that in trying to capitalize on the popularity of the music, they force the performers to try and act, which is not where their talent's laid. As a result, you get some truly squirm-inducing moments watching those poor performers doing something they weren't good at. In addition to this, the plots of these movies were so incredibly lame that watching them was tantamount to torture. Most of the early ones, like Don't Knock the Rock, as I mentioned before, had plots where some crusading DJ, in this example Alan Freed, tried to convince parents that rock and roll was actually harmless and wouldn't turn their children into juvenile delinquents. As an example of how awful these movies could be, here's a sample of dialogue. Arnie Haynes and Alan Freed are discussing a local reporter's negative reaction to the music just played when Bill Haley walks up and asks how she liked the band. Haley asks, "How we doing, Dad? The newspaper gal digging us?" To which Arnie replies, "Yeah, real deep. She sounds like she has us plowed way under already." Alan Freed then replies, "That's freedom of the press." And Bill Haley answers, "Yeah, and I always thought that freedom of the press was a tailor who irons your suits for nothing. It shows you." While it's a given that nobody came to these movies for the plots, the complete lack of effort put into the writing doesn't help get the supposed idea of the movie across. The only reason teens came to see these movies was to see their favorite groups or stars perform. Unfortunately, the idea that made sense, staging a concert and filming that, didn't take place until 1965 when Jack Nietzsche and Steve Binder created The Tammy Show, a videotaped concert. It featured Marvin Gaye, The Supremes, James Brown, the Rolling Stones, Chuck Berry, the Beach Boys, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Barbarians, and a host of others. If you get a chance to see this film, grab it. It's fascinating from an historical point of view, as well as featuring some really great performances. The highlight of the show is a performance by James Brown, which is absolutely unbelievable. The man pulls out all the stops and brings everyone, including the backup band, which includes Glenn Campbell and Leon Russell, incidentally, to their feet cheering, and brings him back for 2 encores. The Rolling Stones had the unenviable task of coming on after Brown, and to this day, Keith Richards says that following him was the biggest mistake of their careers. Getting back to the giant Gila monster, music is shoehorned into the movie as Chase is a singer, although more of a folk singer than a rock and roll singer. The 2 numbers featured, My Baby Rocks Whenever She Rolls and the Mushroom Song, were written and are sung by Don Sullivan, who plays Chase and accompanies himself on a ukulele. In spite of the fact that ukuleles have never been big instruments in the creation of any rock and roll I've ever heard, that is what the music is referred to as being. He sings that damn Mushroom Song 3 times during this movie, and that's 2.5 times too many for me. Of course, when he performs it at the dance, it goes over like gangbusters, which underlines the fact that this is, after all, a work of fiction. He sings it mostly for his little sister, Missy, who just happens to be crippled. It inspires her to walk, possibly because she was desperate to get out of the room when he starts singing it. Fred Graham, who plays Sheriff Jeff, was born October 26, 1908 in Springer, New Mexico, appearing in 194 films and 95 television shows as an actor and 95 films as a stuntman. He played semi-pro baseball and in 1928 landed a job with the sound department at MGM. In 1934, the studio made a murder mystery called Death on the Diamond, and Graham was assigned to tutor the stars of the movie, Robert Young and Nat Pendleton, in the finer points of baseball, as well as doubling for Pendleton. This led to a long career as a stuntman, doubling Clark Gable, John Wayne, Nelson Eddy, and many others. He doubled Basil Rathbone in The Adventures of Robin Hood, and was a member of David Sharp's stunt team in hundreds of films. Sharp himself worked for Hal Roach in the 30s, and if you remember the our-gang comedy Second Childhood, it was Sharp doubling Zeffie Tilbury in the scenes where she was skating backwards, hacking the curtains with a sword. Fred Graham died on October 10th, 1979 in Scottsdale, Arizona. One of the fun things while watching this movie is spotting the goofs in it. I don't normally enjoy doing this since it takes me out of the movie, but I never really got into this one all that much, so there you go. One is watching the engine pulling the train change from a switch engine to a streamlined locomotive and then back again, or seeing the reflection of director Ray Kellog's hand in the windshield of Old Man Harris's car as he cues him to turn his head, or the shadow of the boom microphone creeping into the bottom of the shot when Chase, the sheriff, and Old Man Harris take off to investigate another crash. You'll have to watch closely and pay attention to see these, but they are there. If you spot any I missed, drop me an email and let me know. So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the giant Gila monster right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.